Welcome to the deep dive.
Hi there.
Our mission today, well, we're going to try and get to grips with a pretty big shift happening in American education.
That's right. The whole landscape of homeschooling, it's really changing.
Yeah, and we've pulled together some insights for this deep dive. We're looking at expert analysis, some empirical research, and also hearing from parents.
Yep, stuff from like a Harvard Kennedy School conference, an article from EdChoice, homeschool connections too, a few different angles.
Exactly. We want to unpack this, surprising surge in the numbers, figure out why it seems to be sticking around, not just a pandemic blip.
And importantly, look at what the actual data tells us about how homeschooled kids do.
Right, which might challenge some of the ideas you've probably heard floating around.
It's definitely a picture of, well, significant evolution,
Yeah.
a real change in how kids are getting educated.
Okay, let's unpack this then. So the sources, they make it pretty clear homeschooling was already kind of creeping up before 2020.
But the pandemic just hit the fast forward button, didn't it?
Totally. Millions of families suddenly dealing with schools closed, all that disruption. And for a lot of them, homeschooling just became the immediate answer, for some stability.
And here's something really interesting to the data, a crucial insight. This rapid increase, it wasn't the same everywhere.
Oh, so.
It was particularly significant among certain groups, like families of color, who, well, historically hadn't homeschooled at the same high rates.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the U.S. Census Bureau, for instance, they reported something like a 5-fold rise just among Black families in 2020 alone.
Wow, 5 times.
Yeah, so that really expanded who was even thinking about homeschooling as like a real option.
So the big question then became, all right, was this just an emergency fix during lockdown, or is this something more permanent?
Exactly. And the early signs, like data mentioned by EdChoice from the Homeschool Hub at Johns Hopkins University, they seem to suggest it is lasting.
Okay.
They found increased participation was still going on in many states, like 3 years after the pandemic's peak. It wasn't just a flash of the pan.
The numbers must show that too, right?
Oh, absolutely. So before the pandemic, like 2018, 2019, it was about 3.7% of American families homeschooling.
Okay.
That jumped, really leaped, to 11.1% in 2020, 2021.
Huge.
Massive. It did drop back a bit as schools reopened, settled around 5.2% in 2022, 2023.
Right. Which you'd expect.
But then, interestingly, it actually nudged up again slightly to 5.4% by the 2024-2025 school year.
So still significantly higher than before the pandemic started.
That's the key. It's a net increase of 1.7 percentage points.
And what does that mean in terms of actual students?
Well, putting it into student numbers, it means homeschooling has grown by roughly 1.5 million students since the pandemic began.
1.5 million. That's a substantial change in the K-12 system.
It really is. And the growth isn't spread evenly across the map either.
Okay. State differences.
Big time. The sources point out major variations. Between, say, 2017-18 and 2022-23, some states saw enormous jumps. Like California, up 78%. South Dakota, 94%. And get this, Washington, D.C. saw a 108% increase.
Wow. Over double in D.C.
Incredible, right?
Yeah.
And it sounds like this isn't just an American thing anymore either.
Oh, interesting. Going global.
Seems like it. The sources project homeschooling as a growing global trend. There's one market research firm estimating like 10.3% annual growth worldwide.
10% a year.
Yeah, and they reckon the global market could be worth over $10 billion by 2031.
Goodness.
We're talking something like 50,000 new students starting homeschooling every single month globally.
So it really paints a picture. This isn't just, leftover noise from the pandemic. It's sustained, diverse growth.
Exactly. It's become a real fixture.
So if schools are mostly back to normal operations, why are families still choosing homeschooling, deliberately choosing it now? What's behind this continued growth?
Right. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the sources, they really highlight that the reasons are incredibly varied, which, makes sense given the wider range of people doing it now.
Yeah, that follows. So what kind of reasons are we talking about?
Well, they really range. Some families are looking to, say, better address specific learning needs, maybe for a child with a learning disability, something more individualized.
Okay, makes sense. What else?
Concerns about school safety, unfortunately. That includes worries about violence, even mass shootings. That's a significant factor mentioned for some parents.
Well, that's a tough one.
It is. Bullying is another one cited quite often. One study mentioned in the sources, it actually showed bullying incidents have risen about 14% since 2017.
14%. Wow, that's concerning.
Definitely. Then you have other families who are motivated more by wanting a greater focus on family life.
Integrating education more into their sort of daily rhythm.
Exactly. Or maybe seeking opportunities for like richer educational engagement, letting kids really dive deep into things they're passionate about.
And I suppose the desire for parents to be more directly involved comes into play too.
Absolutely. That fundamental desire for more direct parental involvement in how their child learns, that's a big one.
And the sources also mentioned concerns about what gets called culture war issues in public schools.
Yes, that comes up too. Sources describe this as families having concerns over specific curriculum content or maybe values being taught that conflict with their own family's beliefs.
Okay.
And maybe just a broader dissatisfaction with what some see as like a monolithic public education system, that sort of one-size-fits-all feeling.
Right. So it's a really long, diverse list of reasons. They feel quite different on the
They
surface.
really do. Which raises that important question. Is there anything connecting these different motivations?
Yeah, what's the common thread, if there is one?
Well, one expert quoted Joel Grew from HSLDA Action. He offers a really interesting perspective.
What's his take?
He suggests it might actually be part of a much bigger trend we see everywhere else in society,
Like what?
like how we increasingly expect to customize everything, right? Our
Good.
work, our travel, what we watch.
Okay. I see where this is going.
Yeah. So in that context, homeschooling is kind of being seen or embraced as the ultimate customization of education.
The ultimate personalization.
Precisely. Families looking for that truly tailored fit, not just for the child's learning style, but for their family values too.
That idea of customization, it does help tie those different threads together.
Mhm.
Okay, so homeschooling is becoming more common, more mainstream, but that also means the debates, the stereotypes, they stick around.
Oh, for sure. You still hear those concerns voiced often. Are homeschooled kids getting a good academic foundation? Are they, isolated, poorly socialized?
Missing out on activities, and sometimes, sadly, those unfounded fears about neglect or abuse even surface.
Right. But what's really insightful here is that research is actively, testing these ideas,
Sure.
trying to see what the data actually shows.
So the sources we looked at, they tackle these stereotypes directly.
They do, with data,
Yeah.
which is really helpful.
Okay, let's take that difficult one first, the concern about neglect or abuse. What did the sources find there?
Well, the research they cited indicates pretty clearly there's no significant difference in child abuse rates between kids who are homeschooled and those in public schools.
Okay, so the data just doesn't support that particular fear.
Correct. It's a direct counterpoint based on the available research.
Got it. What about the bigger picture then? How do homeschooled individuals actually fare later on as adults? Are they prepared for life, socially, academically?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and that's where the Cardis Education Survey offers some really significant insights.
Tell us about that survey.
So it analyzed outcomes for a large, nationally representative group of adults aged between 24 and 39. And crucially, it included people who were homeschooled for different lengths of time.
So not treating all homeschoolers as one identical group.
Exactly. They categorized them short, medium, or long-term homeschooling,
Yeah.
which helps us understand the potential impact across different kinds of experiences.
Makes sense. So what did Cardis find? Let's start with well-being, maybe, since that connects back to parents wanting a safe or less stressful environment.
Okay. Well, the Cardis findings here are, frankly, fascinating. And they really push back against that isolation stereotype.
How so?
Adults who were homeschooled for 8 years or more, so long-term homeschoolers, they actually reported the lowest levels of anxiety and depression symptoms
The lowest
compared to all the other groups in the survey, including those never homeschooled.
Wow.
And not only that, they were also the most likely group to express feelings of optimism and overall life satisfaction.
That's pretty striking.
It really is. The data strongly suggests some kind of link between that long-term homeschooling experience and positive psychological well-being in adulthood, which, as you said, lines up with why some parents choose it, seeking that less stressful, maybe psychologically safer environment.
That really counters the socialization worry, or at least adds a lot of nuance. What about things like civic engagement values?
Yeah, another area they looked at, the survey found that these long-term homeschooled adults, they actually showed higher rates of civic participation,
Like voting.
like volunteering and giving to charity. For instance, 45% of them had volunteered in the last year, and 58% had donated to charity.
And how does that compare?
Both of those percentages were higher than for the non-homeschoolers in the study.
Interesting.
They were also more likely to practice religion and believe in a higher power. And the longer they were homeschooled, the stronger that religious identification tended to be.
Okay.
And another point on the sort of social fabric front, this long-term group was also the most likely to be married and have children, and interestingly, the least likely to have gotten divorced among the groups studied.
So far from being isolated or disengaged, the data seems to point towards maybe higher rates of community involvement and family formation for that long-term group.
That's what these findings suggest, yes. It paints a very different picture than the stereotype.
Absolutely. Okay, what about the more traditional metrics like academics and career success, income?
Right. So in terms of just educational attainment, getting degrees and diplomas, adults who are homeschooled for 3 years or more were actually more likely to finish with a high school diploma or an associate's degree
More likely.
than those homeschooled for shorter periods, or those never homeschooled.
Okay.
The picture changes slightly when you look at household income, though.
How so?
The survey found that the short-term homeschoolers and the non-homeschoolers were actually more likely to have household incomes above the national median compared to the long-term homeschoolers.
Okay. That's interesting. Did the sources offer any potential explanations for that income difference?
Yes, there was some speculation offered. One idea is that perhaps adults who are homeschooled long-term, maybe based on the values emphasized during their education, potentially place less primary importance on, say, maximizing financial income compared to other life values.
Like family or community involvement, the things they scored higher on.
Possibly. That was one interpretation put forward.
So if we kind of zoom out and connect all this CARDIS data, what's the bigger picture?
Well, the results really seem to challenge many of those common negative assumptions about homeschooling. They paint a picture where adults who are homeschooled, especially long-term, often appear to be well-adjusted, civically engaged, and leading fulfilled lives.
But it's important to remember the correlation point, right?
Absolutely crucial. As the source itself notes, this is correlational data.
Yeah.
It shows associations, patterns, links. It doesn't prove direct cause and effect. We can't say homeschooling causes these outcomes.
Got it. But the patterns themselves are compelling, and they definitely run counter to many stereotypes.
Very much so.
So the clear takeaway then from all these sources combined seems to be that homeschooling isn't some temporary blip or a niche thing anymore.
Not at all. It's a growing, significant part of the American K-12 education scene, and all signs point to it being here to stay.
And that trend towards customization that we talked about, the idea highlighted by experts like Joel Grew, and you mentioned Amir Nathu, too, CEO of OutSchool,
Yes.
that really suggests that the traditional school models, well, they're facing a fundamental challenge.
It seems that way. They either need to adapt somehow, find ways to better meet these diverse specific needs that families and students have,
Or what?
or they'll likely continue to see people shifting towards these more customized alternatives, like homeschooling. It increases the competition, essentially.
It definitely forces a bigger conversation about the future shape and even the purpose of education itself.
Couldn't agree more.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you listening? This deep dive, it really shows a sustained shift happening in how families are choosing to educate their kids.
Yeah, and it's driven by this complex mix of really personal factors, everything from safety concerns and individual learning needs to wanting more family time or just wanting that tailored educational experience.
And crucially, the research we've dug into suggests that for many, homeschooling is proving to be a valid and effective path. It seems to be producing positive outcomes in many areas and really challenging those old stereotypes.
It highlights that homeschooling has just become a much more accessible, more appealing option for a much wider range of families than it ever was before.
So here's a provocative thought for you to chew on based on everything we've discussed. If this trend towards customized learning keeps accelerating, as it seems to be, how might the growing presence and acceptance of homeschooling fundamentally challenge the structure, the funding, maybe even the very purpose of traditional public schooling in the years ahead?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Something to definitely mull over.